All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm happy to have everyone tuning in here for our hangout on project-based learning in an AP environment, something that a lot of folks struggle with for sure. And we've got some great guests, some surprise guests, and I'm gonna introduce them for a moment here, and then give them an opportunity to talk about themselves a little bit more. And looking, at least for me, going this way to that way, we've got a friend of mine, Dana Lauer, who's also a Buck Institute national faculty. DanaLauer.com is her website, and the author of this wonderful book. She didn't know I was going to do this, but I pulled it off that bookshelf back there. Authentic Learning Experiences. Highly recommend that, and her fun blog. And then over here, we can see chiming in from just outside of Fort Wayne in Huntington at one of the New Tech schools, Viking New Tech, we have Lynn Brown and her friend. It's Mr. Steensma. Remind me of your first name, please?
It's James.
James. I'm going to say Joel, and I knew that wasn't right. I'm going to go ahead and give you two an opportunity to talk about yourselves a little bit. Just tell the folks who you are, where you are, and what you're doing, that kind of thing, and then we'll shift to Dana, and then we'll kind of get going.
So we're here at Viking New Tech. We are teaching a American Studies class that is dual credit and AP driven. It has 11th grade honors English, American Lit with American history. It is a block class, so we teach it together. This is the third year for it to run, and this is my third partner to work with in this course. I've also taught AP Psych in a project-based piece on the main campus, so that was a standalone class.
Okay. James?
And my name's James Steensma. I'm actually a second-year teacher. I have the privilege of working with Lynn the last 2 years. This year, moving up to the 11th and 12th grade level. So teaching the English side, the honors English aspect in the block class with Lynn in the AP U.S. history portion. So a lot of our writing supports what it is that she's accomplishing in the classroom and creates an interesting dynamic that way.
Okay, great. So this is you said your second year in the classroom total, or second year there at New Tech?
Both, actually.
Okay. So second career?
Second career, that's right.
All right, well, good stuff. And what did you do beforehand?
I was in corporate sales.
Okay. All right.
I did a lot with philanthropy and working with nonprofit organizations to help meet their needs in particular areas.
Okay, good deal. All right, well, let's shift over one in the film strip and give Dana an opportunity to introduce herself and talk about herself a little bit.
Thanks, Drew. So I am a former social studies classroom teacher. I spent 14 years in the classroom, and that included about 10 of those years as an AP government teacher. And for the last 7 years of my high school teaching career, I was fully wall-to-wall project-based learning in all of my classes, including the AP course, which was the last class that I ended with and bringing fully online, but I'm sure we can talk about that a little bit later. And I've now been out of the classroom for going on 3 years because my life as a wife, a mom, an author, and a trainer kind of took hold and didn't leave much time for me to fully devote to my students in the classroom and what they needed. So it's been a whirlwind of the last 3 years working all across the country and getting to interact with wonderful teachers and meet people like Drew in my travels and you know, share some of the great things that I've learned from the teachers around the country, whether they've taught AP, whether they've taught special ed, and everything in between.
Okay, great. Well, just a reminder to folks, if you are tuning in, you should have an opportunity to ask questions via the YouTube question and answer app, although I've never experienced it from a user perspective, and I certainly don't know exactly how it works, and with Google and that kind of stuff, some things are you wonder, they change things. So hopefully you'll be able to ask some questions via that way, or you can tweet at me down there at dperkinsed, and I can also grab some questions from that perspective. So what I'd like to do first, I guess, in this time is really just kind of talk about PBL and the need for it. And obviously, there's a lot of folks who do AP and really feel like it's difficult to do project-based learning. Well, first of all, some folks think it's really hard to do overall, but in an advanced placement setting, that it might be more difficult because of the constraints and things like that. So I guess if I can get both of you, or all three of you, to sort of react to the need for PBL, specifically in an advanced placement setting, whether that's U.S. history or social studies, which is my background. I taught AP psychology as well, and did some AP U.S. history and AP government. So Lynn, and for you all, what's the reason? And why is it so important to do PBL in an advanced placement when typically you have kids who are, and I say typically, you have kids that are driven and pretty compliant and work hard and that kind of thing?
That's all very true. My first piece of evidence is going to be our alumni that come back and talk to us about their success in college. And we have not had a single kid who hasn't come back and said, you know what, you have really served us well for our ability to speak in public, our ability to work with teams of people, our ability to write well, our ability to plan, our ability to work out and problem solve for ourselves. And the one that I hadn't really foreseen was our ability to work with our professors and be able to make contact with them and to be able to communicate our needs to them. And that would include some schools that are very project-based, some colleges and universities that really have latched on to project-based, and some very, very traditional schools as well, where our kids have come back and been able to share with us their success. And here in our school, we have all kinds of little tweets and Facebook chunks and pieces like that where the kids have sent back and said, thank you for this piece that you've done for us. So our ability to help them be successful in college, which is really the elephant in the room all the time when you talk about PBL, is this going to serve our kids well in college? For me, I have some really good evidence that, yes, we have done that. The second piece is there is nothing more boring than sitting through a lecture day after day after day. And in a traditional class where we're getting kids ready for college with AP and dual credit, we do a lot of that to them. And our kids are very engaged and very hooked up day after day after day. That piece I don't think you can get with a very traditional mindset for how do you serve kids who are going through an AP class. And the changes in the new College Board exams at least appear, and we won't see the first results until May, but they appear to be very much more how do you think your way through a problem, how to use evidence, document-based evidence to show your deep understanding and your analysis of that problem. So I feel like our kids are going to have a leg up right off the bat because that's how you approach. It's the driving question in PBL. Anything to add, James?
I'll defer to Dana first. I'd like to hear that.
You know, you're absolutely correct on the piece with the current College Board changes. So they're in a cycle revision. They started with AP Bio about 2 years ago. So we know the evidence from at least the first revisions. I know AP US is this year. And we can see exactly how, if we take the old test questions versus the new test questions, where they're asking students to get to those higher levels of thinking. And traditionally, AP students are the ones that are really good at the game of school because they've learned how to memorize information. And we just, as teachers, have to keep in mind that those are the lowest levels of blooms. And we want our students to be at those higher levels of blooms, the highest being that creativity level, which is where that driving question should be. and project-based learning. So not only is it preparing them for the AP exam, which some students, that's their eye on the prize, but it's certainly preparing them for innovative careers where they can go out and be at that level of creation where they are not just consuming information, but they're producing new information.
Absolutely. James, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I would just have to agree with both of them that the relevancy is the model there. I mean, that's the key in getting students, AP or not, but particularly in this situation with AP, to really appreciate and understand what's happening in the classroom is to see how, in the case of history, with what Lynn is teaching, how is what has happened in the past still relevant today, and how do we make it applicable? And I think that's where I have to agree with both of them. That's the major drive behind what appears to be the AP. So.
Yeah, it's interesting as AP and the social studies standards just in general, and obviously not all AP classes are social studies, but looking at the C3 framework of the social studies and where that's going, I love the inquiry arc, you know, and as the AP US history, which it's really quite a task to get through and cover all of that. You know, I do think there's some progress, I guess, in the sense of you know, comparing and contextualizing. And I think the contextualization of all of those facts, whether it's an AP Psych or an AP History, AP Bio, you know, has tended to be, I think, in the past, very, very fact-driven, and like you all said, kind of at the lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy in a lot of cases, especially from a teacher's perspective of trying to get through all of that stuff. So contextualizing, I think, is one of those things that we talk a lot about in project-based learning. So how do we contextualize some of these things that have happened so long ago, and why is it important that that kids are learning them outside of just the test, which Dana said, you know, we've got a lot of kids who are really good at playing the game of school and getting that test and acing that test, or at least getting a 3, right? So as you all think about contextualizing and designing instruction and units and PBL projects, what are some of the things about, or sort of tips and tricks or things that you might give advice to teachers around contextualizing any of the content in your AP classes? And I'll open this up to anybody here.
I would say the biggest piece is, what is that driving question? Why does this matter in the bigger scheme? And if the takeaway isn't something I can have a dinner conversation with my friends about, then it's probably not something worthy of being in my AP classroom as well. That keeps us from doing the pretending that we're creating something that matters, and move it into, this is something that actually matters. This is a real takeaway that is important to have at a dinner conversation with my friends, whether you're an adult or a kid. And the more times you can make those connections for kids, the more engagement there is, and the more that they understand this is an important piece. When Dana was speaking, I remembered my first year teaching in a project-based environment, wall-to-wall, and those kids were very much the kids she described. They were all about adding up points, and that was my biggest struggle, was helping them to see, why does this matter today, and why is this more important than what is my score on the final exam, or what is my score on the AP test.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I really agree with that relevancy piece, and moving away from the points that I've earned to the empowerment as a student that I feel. So at the end of the project, when I have this final product that I've presented to some sort of a public audience, whatever that public audience may be, you know, has the work that I've completed, does it have real meaning? And that in and of itself just deepens that understanding by the student, which will then automatically improve the scores that happen on the tests, because they have internalized that information now, rather than just being coverage of the standards and or the content that the College Board lays down. Now it becomes that uncoverage through the inquiry process and that deep understanding that takes place and through the relevancy of the material, then that helps the students really to just do much better all the way around, not only on the exams and with grades, but to being lifelong learners and studiers of the material.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I was kind of preparing and thinking about this hangout, I was looking at some of the research, and you know, as I said earlier, I think it's important to note that a lot of those kids in AP, not all, you know, here in Kentucky, we have Advanced Kentucky, which is really focused on getting some of those kids who are not typical AP students into those classes. But you know, if you think about those kids that are compliant and the good students, it's easy, I think, or maybe easier to sort of just get by with a more of a transmission model of teaching because they're more compliant. There's less behavior issues, and you know, it's an AP class. Sometimes people think, oh, it's an easier class because of the less of behavior issues. But you know, those folks really, those kids really report when they've been exposed to or learned AP in a PBL environment that it's so much more engaging and so much more exciting and interesting. And I think that, like you all said, that deep learning takes place, and I like how Dana talks about empowerment as opposed to engagement, or in addition to engagement. Am I able to present my ideas to somebody who really matters? Not that we don't matter as teachers, but they see us every day, and the same thing with the students. So getting outside of the classroom. Lynn and James, if you wouldn't mind sharing an example of a project, perhaps, if you could sort of walk us through something that is AP and PBL, to give the folks, and I know there's some viewers, and I'll remind them to add questions either in the Q&A thing or here on Twitter, and I've got a second screen I'm pointing to over there. But please, by all means, if you're watching, and I see that there are some folks watching, please add your comments and questions so we can pull them in. But if you all don't mind sharing some examples of PBL in your AP classes, that would be great.
I will start with the AP Psych because I know, Drew, you taught AP Psych for a while, and that will give James time to think about which AP American Studies project he wants to talk about. But one of the projects that I did very first off the bat that I kind of loved, and it was as high risk as anything on the planet. So I allowed the kids, when we were doing social theory, to pick a topic surrounding our school corporation that they felt like social theory could be used to make an improvement on. And they looked at the 100 most effective schools in the nation according to a study. And they read the research, and they looked for pieces of social theory that they saw within those schools as they were self-reported. And then they looked at what did they think was actually practical and could happen here at Huntington North High School. And so they chose their own audience. They chose who is it that we actually have to report to, who is it that we have to take this findings to because they can actually make a difference. So they all had a different audience. Some people had to go to the school board, some people had to go to the principals, some people went to the custodians because they thought the lighting in the building was causing stress in the building and how much would it cost to create dimmer switches throughout the building, and here's the science behind that. The highest risk of all of them were kids who were saying, you know what, we see a flaw in our AP program in the entire building, and the reason we see this flaw is we're jumping over material and content because we're being pushed ahead, and so these pieces of information no one has given us, and we're kind of left out there on our own to figure that out while the teacher is believing that we already have this information. And so they actually presented to their AP teachers in a conference room with their slides and their evidence and their explanation while they're still students in those AP teachers' classrooms. I'm not sure there's higher risk on the planet than that. And they used the theories, and they explained the theories, and they were kind, and they were gentle, and they very much took the approach of, here's the evidence that we saw, and here's how we could be helped more in the future. That made me cry just a little bit because they were scared to death, and yet they did a brilliant job. And I have to say, some of my peers, some of my fellow AP teachers were not real excited to hear this information from their students. But they were professional in that situation. There's nothing that you're going to ask someone to do on the work site that is more difficult than what those kids took on for themselves. Or stepping in front of the school board and saying, here's some pieces of our culture that we can't fix with ourselves. Within our own means, here's what we need you to do to help us and partner with us. That's pretty scary stuff if you're 16 or 17 years old. And they did a brilliant job, and I was very touched by that. And it really sold me on the whole PBL product, because they took those steps amongst themselves, and they took that risk amongst themselves. I'll let James talk about something we're doing in American Studies.
One of the things that we have done coming in with Lynn this year, this is my first opportunity to teach alongside her, is to take some of the projects that have been done at different times and try to tweak them, see if we can find a way, as Dana was saying, to empower the students better, to make it more relevant. We have a little bit of a spoils program here. We have a university across the street, so the students do get to interact with college professors on a regular basis here. So one project we just did, we had a professor that was on sabbatical and spent a great deal of time with our students. That was a wonderful experience. And then they turned right around. We're finishing up a project where they're creating their own textbooks, if you will. I don't want to call it a textbook, but at least a guided study for our junior high students. So talk about impacting the community around you. Not only do they get to still be taught from somebody on a higher level than what we're doing here, but then they get to, in a way, teach, pass that learning on to students. I found a lot of power in that as I look at that particular project. And then leading into next semester, the things that we're intending to do and we're hoping to do include everything from doing a Google Hangout, perhaps, all the way from Alabama and things like that. So lots of opportunities for our students to get some real-world experience.
Absolutely. And Dana, I know you've got some examples that you may want to share, or you may not.
There's one that you can actually view online. Edutopia featured it a few years ago in part of the Schools That Work program, and what I did is I partnered my AP Government class with an art class, a sculpture class, because most of those AP students never took the time to take an art class because it would not positively impact and increase their GPA because it wasn't a weighted course. And so while art is not a part of my curriculum, I did want them to have some exposure to the art pieces. And so what we did in our study of public policy was we, as the AP Government students, we looked at the different types of public policies, majoritarian, client politics, all of the 4 different types, and looked at them from both a liberal and a conservative perspective. And we were 2 classes that met at totally separate times. We had different students in each class, and so we did all of our communication online through a wiki, and all of the research that my students did we put online for them to see as art students, the sculpture students, the differences between the liberal conservative viewpoints. And then the sculpture students conversed with us to kind of brainstorm some ideas on how they could represent some different art pieces from political perspectives. So one student created a wire armature of a tank, an army tank, that she had created from a piggy bank that she broke, and put all the broken pieces on it and pennies on it, as in we were breaking the bank with our public policy towards how we were spending our money. And so then my students were able to give feedback on that, and those art pieces then were displayed in our state capitol here in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and my students did the write-up behind those art pieces. Now, that in and of itself is just really scratching the surface for my students, because again, I want them to be at those higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So then to take that further and to meet my curriculum even deeper, then my students created legislation on public policy that they then wrote and presented to our state representative. So taking it to that higher level of Bloom's taxonomy with the creation piece. And I know, because we're a bunch of social studies teachers here, many of you are probably watching and saying, okay, well, that's great, but I teach math or I teach science. So keep in mind, it's not just for the social studies. I had an AP calculus teacher that connected his students with a dealer in tapestries, and his AP calculus students helped to date the tapestries through, and I can't possibly claim to know all of the mathematics behind it, but they did the dating of the pieces for them through AP Calculus. I had an AP Environmental Science teacher in an online course that I teach through PBLU that actually took a 3rd grade project called the Schoolyard Habitat Project, and she turned it into an AP level project where her students were working with aphids and trying to reintroduce the aphids into the population, into their schoolyard habitat. So some amazing things that you can do out there with any of the AP courses, not just the social studies.
Yeah. Were you guys going to say something?
I was just thinking, when Dana was speaking about the State House, I'm fascinated with how easy it is to get people in the public world to come and play with us and work with our kids, and how impressed they are with the level of these kids' thinking and work. And you know, last year we were blessed. We had the lieutenant governor come and sit on a panel with our kids, as well as our mayor and our state representative and those. And they really they came thinking they were going to push our kids, and at the end of the day, I think they were pushed a little bit at how much research our kids have done and how deep their understanding was. The project was looking at the Founding Fathers and looking at a current issue in public debate. And one of them, for example, was the Affordable Health Care Act. And the young lady who led that project really didn't understand it at all when she started, but everyone was talking about it. And so she wanted to know more about it. And their goal was to say, the Founding Fathers would have thought this about this piece of law that's happened, and my proof is, and they had to go back to the primary sources and dig through them. And then the kids got to say, and here's what I think. This is what I think should go forward. I couldn't have been more proud of our kids, because we invited Democrats and Republicans both purposely, so that whatever side the kids took, somebody from the other side was going to ask them some push questions, and they got pushed hard. The people that came forgot they were kids for a little bit, because the information my kids were giving was so deep that they forgot they were 16 and 17-year-olds for a little bit, and they got hammered pretty. You know, the mother bear in me wanted to jump up a couple of times and defend my kids, but they didn't need me. They did a brilliant job. And I am very impressed with how the public is beginning to perceive what our kids are able to do because of the opportunities that they have, and Dana reminded me of that.
Yeah, you know, as I work with teachers around PBL, one of the things that I hear quite often is, you know, or is they're diving into it. First steps is they won't have an authentic public audience, and it's easy to sort of forego that, because you think, well, you know, that's some legwork, that's some calls I have to make, and I'm not sure anybody's going to come in. But when they do, you know, for those teachers who don't have one, and then the next project they do have one, and the leverage around quality that and the engagement that comes with that is such a powerful lesson. And it's always fun to watch teachers have that sort of aha moment, like, oh, so I can have them present to people outside of the school and use that as a leverage point to think about, does your work meet the needs of the audience in a way that's it's a quality control piece. And they do tend to really, they see us every day as teachers. They see their classmates, and not that we're not important, because we are, and the AP test is important. But when I had kids present to a senator, it was just like, they sat up in their seats, and this is a guy who he's a farmer in the county, but he's a state senator. To them, that's a big, big deal. And the quality of their work certainly was much improved, and certainly much higher level of engagement and excitement. So when we think about it, AP, I think about it almost in terms or very similar to a lot of math teachers who say, boy, I can't get through all my content. And AP certainly shares that sort of sentiment in a lot of cases. I've got to get through all of this by May 14th or whatever that test date is, come snow days or zombie apocalypse or whatever, right?
We had both here last year.
You what?
We had both snow days and the zombie apocalypse. We missed 3 weeks of school last year in one semester.
Yeah.
So I'm all with you on that.
Yeah. So if I'm an AP teacher out there and I'm saying, well, I don't have time to do PBL, I can't get through all this content, what's the advice, or what would your response be?
Well,
we're seeing Dana.
I'll go ahead and chime in. I'll go back to that statement that it's not about the coverage, but it's about the uncoverage. So if we're plowing through the information, how much of that is each of the students going to actually internalize, understand fully, and be able to then take to those higher levels of thinking when the new College Board tests are coming out? So that's really one piece of it. I think the other piece of it is, and this was a lesson that was really taught to me by my AP students, because as I said initially, the AP class that I taught was the last class that I went to as fully project-based learning, because I had that exact same mindset. I said, there's no way when I'm teaching this as a second semester course, and I have this AP test to get ready for, and we were always the first test the first morning, so I was going to have a month less of time in order to be with my students to get them ready for that test. And they were the ones that convinced me. They actually developed the project themselves. It came out of a conversation that we were having one day in class, and they said, hey, Mrs. Lauer, wouldn't this be great if you would just let us do this? And I let go, and I let them take the reins. And the big thing that they taught me was this: it doesn't matter that I had certain chapters that needed to be covered and certain units that needed to be covered. They were able to take the information from different chapters, from different units, and integrate it together. And so what I started to do was look for what were those themes and those commonalities, instead of segmenting everything that I was teaching into the chapters and into the units. I looked for those themes, and now the information actually made much more sense to them, and I was able to ensure that I was incorporating all of my content, all of my standards in that semester time, and even in a shortened time period when it came time for the test. And I won't lie, in that second semester, there was always going to be one unit that we weren't going to be able to do a project with prior to the test. So we would do some kind of cramming initially before the test, and then after the AP exam, then we would go back and take our time on that unit and spend doing it justice with an actual project.
Okay, Lynn, John?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, that's what Dana just said there a moment ago was really relevant to me, because that was one of the great pieces of advice I got last year coming into a PBL environment. Was sometimes the end product is not the lesson. It's that process all the way through it. And so as a result, because of our scheduling, we knew that maybe the product was going to have to shift, or it was, in some cases, be amended greatly to be able to make sure we got the content covered still. So, as much as we talk about project-based, I think it's important to know that the project truly starts from day one and goes till the end of the piece. whatever that looks like. So I appreciated her honesty, because that was a great piece of advice she just gave. I received that same type of advice last year, and it's really served me well, taking a lot of the stress out of the equation.
For me, it has been the big connecting pieces in history, or the big stones in psychology. How do I touch on those over and over again in lots of different project pieces? And because you have that freedom and project base, the kids get a deeper understanding of that core content. And then how do you structure scaffolding pieces to support them when they know that they aren't getting a piece of information? And they will figure that out as they're working their way through a project. When they run across something and they are saying, Brown, I don't understand how this fits in, or I'm not clear on this tiny piece. And then it takes me 3 or 4 minutes in like a little mini session to go over it, as opposed to an entire day with PowerPoint slides and all the craziness I used to do once upon a time.
Oh, and I would definitely concur with that piece. You know, instead of doing just full class lessons day after day after day, now you really have that opportunity to differentiate for the students and where they need the additional scaffolding. So, you know, you as the teacher know your content the best, so you're going to know what mini lessons probably that you're going to have to plan ahead of time. And there may be days when I announce, okay, we're going to do a mini workshop on this, and I may only have 5 students that stand up to need help. And there were times when I said, okay, we're going to do a mini lesson on that, and I would have the entire class, all 30 of them, stand up. And I would say, okay, we'll do full group instruction on this. And they'd say, no, 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 no. Can we do multiple mini groups? Because they like that. But it's a great way for differentiation as well, like Lynn said.
And the power of the kids asking for it. You don't get that glazed over look because they came to you and said, can I have this piece of information? So it's not our saying to them, this is important for you to know. It's them coming to that conclusion themselves. Crazy powerful.
Yeah, the role of inquiry, you know, I often say if I was going to boil PBL down to 2 things, it would be inquiry, kids making, creating, or doing something, and us as teachers and them really as students using inquiry to get them there, which can start from a big perspective. You know, you think about your driving question, and I want to talk a little bit about essential questions versus driving questions, because I think there's when you think about especially U.S. history, there's typically a lot of essential questions out there that are not necessarily good driving questions. But the use of that need-to-know list and a list of inquiry that really is another sort of tip that a lot of teachers, when they get started in PBL, it's sort of like contracts or rubrics. You'll pass them out or do it and then sort of forget about it and put it to the side, right? And then you wonder why it didn't work. But the power of the metacognitive process of kids to say, boy, I really do need to know this, or I hadn't thought about that, and as you're spiraling, not just semester-wide or year-long, but you're spiraling through your project, sort of doubling back on that deep inquiry, because I thought about something, but they hadn't thought about it through this lens. Oh, now we have some different questions to think about, and how do I find that out? And Lynn, I think you said it really eloquently. I mean, when kids come to you, instead of you saying, hey, today you need to learn this, them coming to you and saying, hey, today I need to learn this, it really flips the script and really makes a very powerful classroom. So I did want to, like I said, I had actually printed these out from, was it the Gilder Lehrman, and, you know, essential questions are certainly not new. But this is a list of, 163 essential questions in history. I don't know at what point they stop becoming essential. If you have, you know, 200, does that become less essential? And I think a lot of these are really good. And I had written a blog piece at one point about the C3 framework and the inquiry arc. As you think about questions that are important, and I wrote a blog piece the other day. Are the questions you're asking important to you or your students? Because I think these essential questions are often teacher questions. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're engaging to kids and they go, oh boy, I really would like to know about that. But you know, you walk into a classroom of high school kids and say, hey, was George Washington's leadership indispensable in successfully launching the new federal government? And you know, they're going to say yes, right? Um, so how we frame that in a context, and again, contextualizing things in a way that does get kids to dive in and jump in. You know, what are the questions that we can ask that are important to students that also get them to ask and answer those questions that are important to us? So with that in mind, I'd like to give you all an opportunity to talk about that and questions and inquiry just in general, but are there some great driving questions out there that you have used or seen or thought you know would like to share through your class or any other classes?
Well, first, I think a great driving question has to be a question I can ask anywhere in any situation, and people go, yeah, well, what is that? Or they'll immediately want to talk about it, whether I'm with my friends at dinner or I'm talking to my family or I say something to James, you know, first thing in the morning. That's a great driving question. And the more I can focus on that with the kids, the better, because first of all, that's real communication and real problem solving and really thinking. So if you ask a kid a question like, should Lee have gone across that battlefield at Gettysburg? Like 6 historians and I will be excited about that question, and that's about it, right? Like the guys at the university are excited about it. If I say to them, so is it ethical for people who are up on a hill to take out the people coming across the field at all costs? The more people you kill, the better, because I've won the battle. Is that ethical? Then you get kids to talk to you about that. So looking at it just from is this something that actually needs to be talked about or not? And is this something that still we're concerned about or not? Because when you start talking about the ethics of a battle, then you're talking about, oh, is it ethical to use drones to take people out? Those kind of things we're still talking about. And framing it up that way is so much more valuable than saying to kids, well, that's a driving question that came from a textbook. That won't work. It won't work when I'm having dinner with my friends, and it won't work in a classroom.
Yeah, and I think that you make a really good point there. In an AP class, again, with so much to cover, to deal with, and that pressure of that May test, I think it can be easy to forget this or to say, well, I don't have time for that. But when we talk about contextualizing and putting it with other pieces of or disciplines and content, you know, ethics is not necessarily like history specific. Or you know, probably any content specific, but when you start pulling in things like art or and I think that history in a civics and government context clearly makes much more sense and contextualized, because then you've got those leverage points of, so why was this important and how was that important? And so I think it's a great piece of advice to think about, how do you pull in other pieces of content, and is it important? Like, so when you play that devil's advocate working with teachers and saying, all right, so why is this important? Why is it important that you learn this or that your kids learn this? And if you can't answer that question other than it's on the test, or you know, teachers going to require it, or need it for a grade, then you're really going to struggle to find that context in something that's engaging. So why do adults need to know this? And if they do need to know it, then can we get kids to do things similar, especially high school? They can certainly practice being young adults and do things that are similar in that respect. So so biggest struggles when you think about dealing with a PBL environment in an AP environment, what are some of the biggest struggles that you've had, and obstacles, things that got in the way? And Lynn, John, I'll let you all talk, and then Dana can can reflect on that as well.
What do you think, James?
I think one of the biggest struggles now, again, we have the opportunity to teach two types of content in the classroom, but is looking at the types of learners in the classroom that they've all signed up for an AP course, but there are still vast differences between those students. And we see various levels of engagement and various levels of ability. So it's really still connecting to them on that very personal level and getting in the trenches with them as necessary. And some days holding their hands and working through every little bit of the process to make sure that they are fully engaged. And that can be a struggle. That can be a true struggle for any of us in the profession, I'm sure. But especially there, because our presumption, I believe, is that we presume that they should already have a higher understanding of material than other students. And I think, Drew, you mentioned something earlier where we're trying to get more kids into these AP courses. You know, sometimes we find out perhaps they're not as ready as we anticipate. So we have to work sometimes twice as hard to really get them to buy in.
My partner James has a great heart for kids, and we just heard that. Let me give you the other piece of that, though. Lots of AP kids come in, and they do not want to be challenged. They want to get good grades. And they've done a really good job of figuring out how to work that, how school works. And so when you start to challenge them in a PBL setting, the wheels can come off the bus occasionally. There can be some serious stress, and sometimes that stress comes from the kid's point of view, sometimes it comes from the parent's point of view, sometimes it comes from both. But I say to them often, I don't know that you can really call yourself a student if you aren't in danger of not being successful in a classroom setting. If you aren't taking a class that's actually challenging you, then what's the fun of even being here to begin with? And so a lot of times the PBL piece pushes kids harder than they expect to be pushed.
Dana?
So I'm sure that you all caught my kids coming home, my phone ringing, my answering machine going off, and my power leaving me on my computer all at once here. When it rains, it pours. But you know, I'm going to touch on two things. I would definitely concur with what Lynn said about those students who don't want to be pushed. Inevitably, I would always have at a minimum 2, maybe 3 students and as many as 4 students that would leave my class after the first 6-day cycle and say, Mrs. Lauer, I'm sorry, no offense, but I'm going to go down the street to Penn State York and take the class there because I know I will get an A from that professor because he will tell me exactly what I need to know. So it is a huge struggle to kind of break through that barrier. But on the flip side of that, I had more non-traditional AP students that were willing to take my course because they had had me for other classes that I taught, and they felt like they would be able to be successful because just because they weren't good test takers in other classes didn't mean that they couldn't do that level of work that was required of them for my course. The other piece really that I think hits home, if we go back to the whole essential questions versus driving questions, I think it's a huge challenge for AP teachers to move away from the essential questions because they say, this is what I have to cover, this is what the College Board tells me, and so that's what I need to do. But if we write our driving questions in such a way that they are not Googleable, but they're bloggable, then you're really hitting the nail on the head. So is it something that's actionable where my students can continually go back to that question and add new understandings to it, and maybe they run into roadblocks, and through the inquiry process they're uncovering additional answers, and they may start down the path in one direction and then they have to make a complete U-turn or a left-hand turn or a right-hand turn depending on where they end up going with it, because there is no one right answer, and that's a huge challenge for any teacher, let alone an AP teacher who is used to having just one right answer. So you have to be willing to make that shift, not to being the all-knowing teacher, but being that learner alongside with your students.
Yeah, and It's funny to hear you talk about, Dana, the going down the road to take it at a different place. Uh, my most recent, before I left the classroom, teaching experience with AP psychology and having students do the same, come to me and say, should I take this from you or should I take it from the community college, which is a short walk away? And my answer was always very similar. I said, well, if you want a good grade, that's probably the easier route. And here you're probably going to be more engaged and interested in. And one of the struggles that I had trying to do PBL in AP and non-AP was just the school setting, which is certainly not atypical of a lot of teachers. Is the school culture one that is about achievement, which is scores and closing gaps in data, which is very AP-ish, right? I mean, how many of us as AP teachers were asked what our percentage rate was in passing? And that's important, right? But is that the judge of success, or is the culture of your school and of your classroom around teaching and learning and improving that teaching and learning, which I think what all of us here would agree is if you're doing great teaching and learning, the scores and achievement will come with it. So with some of the struggles and obstacles out there that we've talked about, let's flip the script a little bit and what are some of the successes as you reflect on your teaching and any individual sort of anecdotes, or we can even talk about the scores. How do you think it affected the scores? And I'm also curious how you all see. Do you see AP being different when we talk about doing PBL? Is it different than other classes? And if so, in what ways and how? But Lynn and John, I'll let you all start by talking about any successes and thoughts, things that sort of stand out as wins.
We started with, and I'm going to say this again, our current college students who have gone off and gone to a traditional four-year school are raving about how we got them ready for that situation, and they will give you very specific examples of standing up and giving a speech in a class, and that's a relatively easy thing for them to do, and for the rest of the class it's the scariest thing possible. Some of our college students have come back and they sit on panels with our current students, and they routinely are telling our current students how ready they are for college based on what they're able to do in a presentation. That gives me more satisfaction than any test score is ever going to give me. But I know that my kids are going to go and be successful against the best of the best in our United States University situation. Test scores are equivalent to the test scores outside of our PBL. So if I'm teaching the class in a PBL situation, and I have a very, very brilliant peer who's teaching the class in a much more traditional situation, our test scores are not much different, are markedly different. I'm not doing better than him, nor is he doing better than I. We do not teach in a super academic school. Academics, it's important for kids to graduate. Most of our kids are going to try to go on to some other secondary kind of school, lots of tech schools and those kind of things. And so I'm not living in that pressure cooker that some schools, some teachers live with, that if all of their kids don't get a 3, 4, or 5, then they're out the door. So from that standpoint, I don't feel the same kind of pressure. I know that some of my peers just in a county over or school over are going to feel if they switch to a PBL piece. It is nerve-wracking when you first do it, just because you have to take all the safety features off of your class to be a great PBL teacher. And so that first 2 years is very, very stressful. But I'm blessed to have done it now for more years, and I get to see the long-term effects of it.
John?
One of the things that I think I have found to be most powerful is the conversation with the students, moving away from that lecture mentality and really allowing them to immediately give us feedback to what they believe is happening. That conversation is so powerful for me, not only as a second-year teacher, but as a somebody that to a lot of these students we still act as father and mother figures, and to hear them in the moment figure out their process of learning or the application of learning, I think has been, for me, it's not really an antidote or anything like that. But more than anything, that's just one of the biggest successes. And being able to partner with the people in this PBL environment, where very quickly we can, I can go to the next door and speak to a math teacher or a science teacher. I'm not chasing them down throughout the building to try to get their feedback. But if there's any way that we can partner together to really drive home that learning, that has just been outstanding. I think that's one advantage to PBL. And then, again, having Lynn on the AP side here with me on a daily basis really allows me to hear her relate to these students in a very adult way that a lot of times we don't do with some of our other students.
Okay. Dana, I'll give you an opportunity to talk about any successes or sort of big wins or anything like that as we wrap up here. We got just a little bit of time left.
I would say one of the biggest successes was in taking over that AP program. The very first semester I taught it, I had 6 students. And by the time I left the classroom, I had students that were waitlisted for my classes and that were maxed out at 30, and they couldn't add any more classes based on scheduled demands. So I think that was a huge testament to what was happening in the classroom. Students wanted to take that class. They wanted to be in that type of an environment. And I'll go back to Lynn's dinner conversation piece, to have parents call you and say, hey, we had this great conversation at dinner last night about what's happening in your classroom, because it's all about stories. I want my own daughters who are in 1st and 5th grade to come home and tell me stories about their learning. And it has yet to happen, which is really a sad thing. So it's all about the stories, can they tell a story about that learning? And I think that's a huge success.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lynn, you mentioned something about college and them coming back and reporting that they were prepared. And I don't want to spend too much time because we do need to wrap up here. But there's a lot of folks who will say, well, there aren't very many colleges, or at least their university experience wasn't PBL-like. It was very stand and deliver, teacher, professor-driven, or graduate assistant, right? So are we preparing them for failure if we do, high school or K-12 in a PBL environment and they go to that? But it seems like a silly proposition to say, well, they're going to suffer there, so we should make them suffer here. That doesn't make much sense to me either. But I think the skills to be able to navigate and problem solve, and I always come back to inquiry. We were having a conversation before we went live here. My little logo here that looks like a question mark-ish because I think inquiry is so very, very important. Can we? Are the students coming home and asking great questions? Are they asking great questions in class? Are they operating in an environment where questioning is really the heart of what they're sort of the norm of operation, because if you can ask the right questions, a lot of times you are better able to navigate all kinds of environments, whether it's a really teacher-directed, professor-directed college, university level, or even marital relations, or dealing with children, that kind of thing. So I just read the book A More Beautiful Question, and I would recommend that to anybody, PBL or not, because that inquiry piece is, to me, so essential. So, well, I want to wrap up here and thank Lynn and John and Dana, and give them an opportunity to wrap it up from themselves. If they have any parting shots or pieces of advice, please feel free to reach out to me. You can see my Twitter handle down there and the website perkinsed.com. But check out Dana's book, Authentic Learning Experiences. It's a wonderful book on and some great practical examples. So Dana, I'll let you give any parting shots or advice, and then we'll move to Lynn and John, and then we'll wrap up and get out of here.
Yeah, I would definitely say the key to the question piece, Drew, is so important, because the more questions we ask, the more answers we uncover, and I really think that's what it's all about, and it's about training the mind to think. To steal some quotes there. But I did a blog piece not too long ago on the university level and how they're beginning to incorporate more and more project-based learning. So there are universities that are out there, so please do not, as an AP teacher, feel like you're failing your students by incorporating project-based learning, because you're doing quite the opposite.
I will tag on to that. The reason that we were able to, in the project James talked about earlier, have a college professor at our beck and call really was because they want to do what we're doing, and they came to watch us. And so we have found a lot of people are contacting us on a fairly regular basis from the college level, asking us what's happening in our classroom, how do we design this. And a number of our students are in similar kind of situations where they have smaller group learning pieces in what really is PBL, whether they're calling it PBL or not. And even those kids who are going to very, very traditional schools, I have a young man who just got a high enough score in his class that he isn't going to have to take the final, and he was all excited. And that's a very traditional classroom setting, but what we did for him here helped him get ready for what he's doing.
Okay, good. John?
What I'll say to wrap, really, I'll let my colleagues' words speak for themselves, so I'll just speak more to this forum. Just say this is powerful, and so I thank you for that opportunity, Drew, that whether it's just with Dana and Lynn and yourself to be able to sit and hash out some ideas, but your viewers and your bloggers and your tweeters as well. Just the opportunity to share together. That helps me as a learner, as you talked about, just keeping that learning process going, whether it's with our colleagues or most especially with our students. So thank you for that. Wonderful.
Well, thank you, and I apologize. I keep saying John. It's not John. It's James. But you jumped in at the last moment this afternoon, and I do appreciate that. Our original intent was not to have John or James in, but it's always great to have a second-year teacher, a fairly new teacher, because a lot of teachers think that, well, maybe if I was 10 years down the road or something like that, and PBL is a journey. There's no like end point. It's not like you get to it's like Maslow's hierarchy of self-actualization. You don't get there and go, I'm here and I don't have any more growth to do. It really is about where can we start, and then where can we grow from that. How is that a growth point? Knowing you're going to make mistakes, and the value in that is that it is a real growth point. So thank you all so much. Check out Dana's book. Like I said, danalauer.com is her website. And Lynn and James, if you're at the Viking New Tech School,
Yeah.
if anybody wants to contact them, I don't know if they want to give out their public email address, but I'm sure you can look them up.
We're both on Twitter.
We're both on Twitter. So Lynn Brown at HNSH. And
I'm James Steensma, all together, no underscores or anything.
All right. So please reach out to them and me if you have questions, and it's nice to have these professional conversations. So we're going to wrap it up, and thanks, and we'll see everybody next time.
Thanks, Drew.
Thank you.